Hello once again, and welcome to another of our teachings in this study of the topic of discipleship. This is the fifth teaching, and for this teaching, we look at Mark 3 and Luke chapter 6. Mark 3 and Luke chapter 6. Mark 3, 13 through 19, and Luke chapter 6, 12 through 16. This is the enlistment for disciples. The enlistment for disciples. Consider the different offers that you receive. I know I personally receive so many offers that sound too good to be true, and because they sound so good to be true, I ignore them. So, for example, every day I could go into my email, and I have a folder that's the junk email folder. And in that junk email folder, there's all these messages that offer things that are free, things that are at no cost to me, things that I only have to do click on this one link. All you need to do is just fill in your credit card information. They just need it for information. And they'll give you something great. And that's when you typically know that it's a scam. But because we're in this world with all these scams, we can become suspicious of any offer, especially these offers that are too good to be true. And we're suspicious when Jesus then calls us to do something. Why is he calling us? What does he want, we might think? And what's he going to take away from me? What am I going to lose, we might think? What might we be getting ourselves into? But Jesus' official and formal call to the 12 disciples gives them and us some advance notice. Okay, here's what you're really signing up for. And so let's see what it is as we read from Mark 3, 13 through 19, and Luke 6, 12 to 16. We begin with Mark chapter 3. I read once again from the New International Version. Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12, designating them apostles, that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. These are the 12 he appointed: Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. To them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. And then turning over to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, beginning in verse 12. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles: Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Mark's gospel in particular shows us the pressures faced by Jesus immediately at the beginning of his ministry. Everywhere he went, people followed. Crowds gathered. He generated this buzz. And it wasn't just people who were you could say, checking him out, bystanders. It was people who were in need. It was people who wanted something from him. People who wanted healing, people who wanted, on the opposite side, they didn't want healing, they wanted to trick him. The teachers of the law, the Pharisees, wanted him to stumble in his words. And so there's this constant pressure. People who want you to do something for them, and people who are after you. People who want you to stumble and fall and who want to trick you. And then at the same time, you have the spiritual pressures, where he's also facing the spiritual warfare of the demonic. We see the pressures that come with popularity. These parallel passages indirectly show us how Jesus dealt with the pressures of ministry. He paused from ministry to go up onto the mountain. You see, how does he deal with it? He goes up onto the mountainside to pray, Luke tells us. And then he shared the ministry and pressures with other people. He gathered a small group around him to share the job. And this is still a good formula for handling the pressure of ministry, the pressure of disciple making. Pause, pray, and people. Pause, pray, and people. And there is a broader principle also. The broader principle is what I was alluding to in the introduction, is that Jesus calls, and so we should come. If Jesus calls us, we should come. It's not like these emails that I get that say, just click on this link, and this will bring you to a great deal. Jesus calls, and we should come. We should do what he's calling us to do. As we've been studying about discipleship in this class, seeing Jesus call people to follow, and then we've been watching people follow. Discipleship is daily. It's not just a one-time decision. Every day, Jesus is calling us to something new, to something unique to that particular day. And the question is whether we will follow today, whether we will follow for what we're facing at this hour. And Jesus graciously tells us ahead of time in broad brushstrokes what to expect as disciples when we click, when we follow, when we do what he's asking us to do. Jesus calls his followers to communion and companionship. That's the first. Jesus calls, so we should come. What is he calling us to? Jesus calls his followers to communion and to companionship. The original Greek words here have a clause starting with a word that always indicates a purpose. Verse 14 tells us the reason, the purpose. He called these 12 disciples was so that they could be with him first and foremost. Jesus wasn't just saying, hey, let's spend a few minutes together, I'll tell you what you're supposed to do, and then you go and do it. And that's how a lot of us can treat maybe even ministry. What are the people around us for? Jesus didn't call people just merely because I want you to do a job. So often in ministry, what's alarming to me is, and I just had this recently, I called a member of our church and said that I would like to get together for a meal with him, and I could hear in his voice some hesitation. I didn't mention why I wanted to get together with him on the phone other than that I wanted to reconnect with him. And so we got together for the meal, and I sat down with him, and one of the first things I said, knowing that there was some apprehension, and I could even see it in him at that point, was the first thing I said was, I don't have any real reason for this meal other than I just want to get to know you a little better. I want to spend some time talking and just know what's going on with you. And at the end of the meal, he chuckled and he said, well, typically if the pastor calls, that means I'm going to get roped into a job. We so often treat ministry that way, where the people around us are merely for jobs. Jesus calls his disciples around him because he wants to be with them. He wants to spend time with them. He's about relationship. Discipleship is not about employment. It's about relationship. The Greek word for disciple means student or follower. In the Jewish culture, disciples learned from rabbis and teachers and usually came to live with their teacher, spending time with their teacher, so they didn't just learn in formal classes. This wasn't something that you could just download onto your computer and just learn. It's part of what breaks my heart that I'm teaching this course in this format where I can't be with the people that I'm speaking with. It's necessary given the time that we are in. It's even nice in some ways that we can do this and we have this capability, but nothing really replaces being in a room with people, being in the same place as people, being around them. It's what broke my heart for several weeks this past spring in the midst of this current COVID pandemic, COVID-19. And it was in this exact setting where I would be preaching to a church of people that I could not see. And I thought they're probably listening, but without that presence, it's just not the same. Disciples naturally developed a close relationship with their teacher. I experienced this in my own seminary experience, how invaluable it was to be on campus, how invaluable it was to be able to get to know my professors. And sometimes we would get together just simply for a meal with a professor. And you'd have conversations about things totally unrelated to class, but things that I still to this day appreciate and remember. Times where we would go and we would go and golf together and do things that were casual and just spending time around them, seeing how what makes them joyful, to see their patience, to see the way that they operate with their families is huge. And Jesus knew that. Such relationships develop credibility because students see the teacher living out the principles they articulated in class. Does this person really believe what they're teaching? Also, some truths are best learned. I've heard it said, some truths are best caught instead of taught. We know this growing up as kids. How many things do you do? And if somebody asks, why do you do that? You say, well, my parents did that. Not that they didn't teach me to do that, but that's what they did. I still have it now. I'm 31 years old, and I'm getting to that stage where it scares me sometimes, the things that come out of my mouth, or the things that I just do. And when my wife points them out, she tells me what I'm doing, and I almost shudder because I know exactly why I do that. That's what my dad did. Something that I caught. It was never taught to me. It's just something that from being around him and seeing him and watching him, I just do myself. Christianity is about following Christ. Following Christ is about relationship, companionship. It's not about church membership. It's not about rules. It's not simply about knowing the right doctrine or about performance. It's not about just making sure that you've been baptized. It's about being with Christ. It's about our hearts. Do we love Jesus? Do we want to be with Jesus? And this shows us that Jesus, as he calls apostles, isn't merely just asking us to do something. He's not just giving a job. He wants to be with us. And it benefits us as well. Consider the mobile phone. Consider the smartphone, the iPhone. Great capabilities, incredible capabilities. The amount of things that device, that little device can do is unbelievable. It's really, truly a smartphone. It's living in some ways. You can talk to it and it talks back to you. And yet, if you leave that phone unplugged, for a lot of times, even just more than a day, all those capabilities go dark and they end. And as the phone goes dead, all those amazing things that the phone can do are of no use. And likewise, Jesus knows that as we spend time with him, as we commune with him, and as we get to know him and spend time around him, it's just like us being empowered, watching how it is that what we were designed to do, we watch Jesus doing. And as we receive his love, as we witness his love, we can go out and we can go and do likewise. Jesus wants to have communion with us, but not just with us. Jesus calls his followers to communicate with others. And this gets to why you're probably taking this course and what you're interested in. He called the 12 to go ahead of him into villages, to tell people about him, and to tell that he was coming, to announce his arrival. They could tell others what they had experienced. They could tell others the things that they'd seen about him and what he was here to do. They could talk about his love and about his gracious words, the stories, the practical truths, and the things that he had not only taught, but the things that they had caught from him. They could talk about Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law. They could talk about him healing the man with leprosy. They could talk about him healing the paralytic. the man with the withered hand. They could talk about being a tax collector until Jesus called me and I followed. They could speak from personal experience because they had been with this rabbi, with this teacher. And Jesus still calls his disciples, he still calls us, his companions, those who spend time with him, to communicate to others about what that's like. Otherwise, how is the world going to know about Jesus? And what are we to communicate about him? What are we to communicate about him? What do we say? This is what stumbles so many people up about discipleship, is because we think, when I talk to people within my church about usually the context of witnessing or evangelism, and I ask them, what is it that holds them back? Or what do they most fear? It's that I'm not going to have the right answers to their questions. But that's somewhat secondary when it comes to discipling, and when it comes to sharing about Jesus and communicating about Jesus. Because the disciples here can merely just talk from personal experience. What's he like? We can think that witnessing, discipling, means knowing the doctrines exhaustively. We can think it means that you need to have a great gospel presentation. You need to have a particular picture that you can give. And though that is helpful, and though it is helpful to have various verses in your mind that are helpful, important verses that quote, that articulate truths, and though it is helpful to know how to answer people's questions and objections, that's not the heart of witnessing. When John 9 tells the story about Jesus, about a man born blind whom Jesus heals, these religious people keep asking him about Jesus. They keep pressing him. They keep telling him, tell us about this Jesus. He has to be a sinner. He must be a sinner. And finally, you hear the man just throw his hands up and say, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. I can't answer that question, but here is what I do know. One thing I do know, he says in John 9, I was blind, but now I see. It's his experience. And that's witnessing. Witnessing is relaying what we personally have heard and seen and experienced. And again, that only happens when we are with Jesus. You can't witness about someone whom you haven't seen, whom you haven't heard, whom you don't spend any time with. Perhaps there are too many of us who are talking about Jesus in the way that we'd talk about perhaps the president of your country. I can tell people a lot of facts and figures about our current president, Donald Trump. But if somebody said, what's he like? The people around him are the ones who will give a much better answer. Not just facts and figures, not just trivia questions, but truly saying who he is and what he is like. So often maybe we don't have anything we can relay because we haven't actually been with Jesus. We haven't experienced his presence, his power, his perfection, and so there's nothing to really relay. But if you are connected to Jesus in communion, if you do spend time with him and around him, you've got lots to communicate to anyone and everyone around you. He calls us to communication. You can talk about different ways Jesus has shown you his love. You can talk about how Jesus recently forgave you, no matter what that sin was that you brought to him. You can talk about what he has been bringing you in his word. What has he been speaking to you? What has he been telling you recently? You can talk about how he's helping you do things that once upon a time you were afraid to try. On and on and on. You've got plenty to communicate when you are in communion with Jesus. But at the same time, you also need to be prepared. Jesus calls us to communion, to fellowship with him. He calls us to communicate with others around us. But Jesus calls his followers also to combat. As we see Jesus interacting with all these different forces, as we see the pressures that are upon him, not everybody is thrilled with this news. Not everybody is thrilled with his presence. There is opposition to the person of Jesus. As soon as Jesus gave them authority to drive out demons, the disciples must have known there would be opposition. There would be forces at work trying to stop him. Demons means there's a devil lurking nearby. And the disciples, as followers of Jesus, would be taking on the demons, the followers of the devil. Jesus, more powerful than the devil, gives the disciples power over the demons. He didn't send out the disciples defenseless. He didn't send them out unarmed, clueless. Jesus calls us to combat. Discipleship is not a call to a stroll in the park. Discipleship is hard. And it is hard not only just in the physical aspect of it, in that it might be tiring or time-consuming, but the spiritual dynamic at play. Jesus is calling us to join in, to enlist. This is the enlistment of disciples. He is calling us to enlist in a great, cosmic, historic, spiritual war. It's similar to how many wars are becoming in our own world. It used to be that wars have always been ugly. Wars are, as I hear some people say, war is hell, they will say. But as I look in my history books, typically wars would have people wearing certain uniforms on this side and a different uniform on the other side, and you could tell which country these people were from, and they had their statements and their beliefs and their king. Same thing about the other side. They had their same thing, and you had battle lines, and you had regiments, and you had particular places, and it was in that way neat and orderly, and you can study it. Well, war, in a lot of ways, isn't that way anymore. Consider the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They differ in that there's no front line. The forces that have gone to those places from America are surrounded, and the enemy is lurking in places where you wouldn't expect. I've heard of the terror of soldiers who are going out on a night patrol not knowing if they'll come back, because they could simply be driving and they could run into a road where there's a mine, or there's one of these roadside bombs. This is the spiritual combat that Jesus is calling us to fight in. Anytime we want to communicate about Jesus, you can expect combat. You can expect opposition. Anytime you want the kingdom of Jesus to advance, there is an opposing kingdom that does not want that advance. And so that means we need to be vigilant. We need to be vigilant. We need to be vigilant. There's a poem, and the poem is about a turkey preparing for the Thanksgiving holiday, which of course that's where turkey is central. And the turkey's older brother warned him not to eat too much, not to become fat, because the farmer at Thanksgiving time is looking for fat, tasty turkeys. So instead, he ate little, he dieted, he exercised regularly. Come Thanksgiving, sure enough, the farmer passed him over because the other turkeys were fatter and were tastier. So the turkey began to abandon his diet now that the danger of Thanksgiving had passed. He became a favorite of the farmer's wife, who began to hand feed him and pet him and sing to him. He thrived as he relaxed in her lap, listened to her singing and humming, and the poem closes with the words, "Beware, young turkey, as you listen to her humming. Thanksgiving is over, but Christmas is coming." And likewise, you can expect some combat when you communicate to people about Jesus, and you can't really take time off. You can expect some people to get angry. You can expect others to just give you the cold shoulder, a deaf ear. Some might laugh at you. Some might ask, "Who do you think you are?" Self-righteous, judgmental. Some might be confused by what you say. And living in America, living in a liberal, free democracy, I don't even understand the opposition that perhaps you, if you live in other nations, other countries, I can't even begin to comprehend the opposition that can be faced. We take for granted in this country, our opposition is that we might get laughed at or ignored. But in other places, you might get shot. You might get persecuted. In a lot of ways, I am not the one to be teaching on this topic. You perhaps could teach more to me about what the cost may be. But we need not be afraid because Jesus, just like the apostles, has given authority, which means the right to communicate with him, and his word will triumph. In this world you will have trouble, he says, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And so you can put on your spiritual armor, which he gives us in Ephesians 6, the same full gear, the outfit that Isaiah says Jesus will wear as he comes into combat. We get the same armor that Jesus wore as he defeated the enemy. Ephesians 6 outlines it all. The belt of truth is going to remind us that we are telling the truth about Jesus, the important truth that people need to hear. The sword of the Spirit reminds us not to be afraid to go on the offensive and to attack falsehoods. Prayer reminds us, again, bringing us back to the first point, that the power, the enablement comes from our relationship with Jesus. Jesus calls his followers to go out, to communicate to others. You can expect combat, but he also calls us then to come together. If this is so hard, it's not, like I said, it's not like you take a day off or you take a season off. But because it's so hard and because it requires so much, he does give us a certain something to recharge us. Jesus calls his disciples forth to community. To community. Communion with Jesus leads to community with everyone who is in communion with Jesus. Jesus calls us together. How many disciples did Jesus call? 12. Why 12? To mirror the 12 tribes of Israel. Jesus was beginning a new people, a new nation, a new kingdom when he calls these 12 disciples. Notice some things about this list of 12 men. He's calling together a eclectic group, an imperfect group, a flawed group of sinners. There's Simon Peter, who many people can relate to with his impulsiveness, his passion, and yet also his stick my foot in my mouth kind of mentality. Jesus names him Peter, the rock, because Jesus looks at what Peter can be by God's grace, not what he is when he's called. There are James and John, men who will be ready to call down fire to wipe out a Samaritan village because it didn't welcome them. Jesus renames them sons of thunder, maybe because he sees that incident in the future. John will later become known for all his writing on the topic of love. Again, Jesus sees how grace can transform these people. Notice the differences. You have Peter, the impulsive one. You have Nathanael, the pensive one. When he's found, he's sitting under a tree meditating. There's Matthew, the former tax collector who worked with the Roman government. There's Simon the zealot, totally opposite end of the spectrum. Zealots hated tax collectors. A terrorist group committed to assassinating Roman soldiers and officials. Jesus perfectly puts together people, picks different people for his community from different, opposite, random walks of life. Maybe people who would be hostile to each other in normal times, but they become now a new community of saints because they are bonded together by something more important. This is the church. This is the fellowship of believers, where you can look around at the other people in the room with you. You can go to church, And you can always find certain people and think to yourself, why in the world would I have any interest in you? What are we doing in this same place? Why are we together here? People who you might even be outside the walls of the church, naturally, you might even be inclined to hate. People who would make natural enemies. Jesus even calls Judas Iscariot into the community to give him an opportunity to taste, to experience love and grace. There is a story of a pastor, and he noticed that a longtime member, Jacob, was no longer coming to church. And so he went to visit this member, and the member met him at the door, knew exactly why he was there. I know why you're here, Pastor, but it's no use. I've just gotten tired of church, tired of hearing the same old ideas. I'm discouraged, and I've just decided to stay home for a while, he said. And you can't change my mind, so you might as well go home. And the pastor replied, I understand that, Jacob. Could I at least come in and warm myself by the fire for a few minutes? And then I'll be on my way after that. Sure. You're welcome. Just come and sit a spell, Jacob said. And after a few moments, the pastor stood up and he moved toward the fire and he stirred it. And he pulled one large glowing ember away from the rest of the embers. And then he returned to his seat near the fire. And after a while, that ember was no longer white hot. It was no longer glowing. It turned black. Jacob, sitting there, picked up on the lesson. I understand, Pastor, he said. I'll be back in church on Sunday. What was the point? What was the lesson? That he absolutely needed the community of the saints, the other glowing embers, the heat of his fellow believers and light of his fellow believers, if he was to survive himself. Discipleship is not me and Jesus, and then me going and conquering the world for Jesus. It's Jesus and us. Imperfect, unfinished, random grab bag assortment of us. Discipleship is all about us coming together to help each other commune and connect with Jesus, to communicate Jesus to our world, to combat against our common enemy. We dare not focus on our differences, but on what Jesus is doing in us and through us. We dare not focus on others' problems. If we will not pray for God's transforming power in our lives, we dare not focus on their sins if we're not praying for their sanctification and ours as well. We dare not point the finger if we're willing to extend the hand in fellowship and support. Jesus calls us to community. That concludes this lesson. Again, 2 points to ponder and then 2 principles to practice. So the first point to ponder is when you consider that Jesus calls his followers to communion with him, to communication with others, to combat against Satan, and to community. How do these areas enable a believer to follow Jesus more closely? Think through each of those areas. How does each area enable a believer to follow Jesus more closely? Second, which area would you say is your weakest? So out of those 4, communion with him, communication with others, combat against sin and Satan, and community with the church, with believers. Which would you say is your weakest? And what can you do to strengthen that area? That naturally brings us to the principles to practice. How could you build community with the person you would like to disciple? So there's somebody you would like to disciple. What does it look like for you to build community with them? Second, what is your personal thought about spiritual combat? And how can you become more of a spiritual warrior and help others become warriors? Those are the points to ponder and the principles to practice. And that concludes this fifth lesson, the enlistment to discipleship.